Most of us like the idea of forgiveness until we're required to put it into practice. When you've been deeply wounded, it can feel wrong. It can feel unjust to simply let the offense go. Today on Truth for Life, Alistair Begg explains why we have to look to God for justice. This is the final message in a series called Shaped by Grace. We're in Romans chapter 12.
We have to be careful that when we come to a verse like 19 and to a phrase like, beloved, do not avenge yourselves or never execute vengeance, we've got to be very, very careful that we do not denude the text of its impact by immediately seeking to qualify it in 1,000 different ways, so that we recognize the very striking nature of it, and then we want to say, but of course it doesn't mean this and it doesn't mean that. I chose not to do that this morning because I wanted us to understand exactly what it does mean, and to face full on, as it were, the very striking nature of the way in which it is expressed. The key, I think, in recognizing the challenge that is contained here is to distinguish between what Paul is saying here on a personal level about personal wrongs that are done to individuals and the temptation for us as individuals to then execute personal vengeance. And the distinction between that interpersonal relationship, which is in 12, and the issues of civil government, which is in 13, is very, very important to keep in mind. Now let's get back to our passage into verse 20, because in verse 20, Paul then moves from the negative to the positive. It's interesting how often he starts with the negative and then goes to the positive. It's his pattern all the way through this section. I'm sure you've noted that. Do not do this, but do that. Don't do this, but do that. Don't take revenge. Leave it to the wrath of God, because this is God's prerogative. And then he turns to the positive. Actually, in some ways, verse 19 is much easier than verse 20, isn't it? Because although verse 19 has to do with the matter of the heart and our internal motivation and so on, in verse 19, no action is required. It's something you're not to do. So as long as you don't do it, you can say, well, I didn't do it. Therefore, I'm golden. It said, don't do this, and I didn't do it. That's super. Well, it would be super if it ended with verse 19. But it doesn't, because it goes to verse 20. And in verse 20, the quote is from Proverbs 25, which you can find later on your own. And Paul says, on the contrary, what you need to do for your enemies is to actually treat them with kindness. Now, it would be a wooden reading of the text to suggest for a moment that this is something that applies only if you have an enemy who's hungry, or only if you have an enemy who is thirsty. So if you don't have any hungry or thirsty enemies, then you're in the clear as well, because it's only if they happen to be hungry or thirsty. Say, you're hungry? No. Beautiful. That's wonderful. I can just ignore you, which is what I was planning on doing from the beginning. No, that would be a silly approach to the Bible, wouldn't it? Clearly, we understand what he's saying. We are not to disdain them. We are not to wreak vengeance on them. We are not to retaliate towards them. We are actually to do good to them. And so the thing just gets tougher. I mean, how tough is this? Just when we thought we were in the clear by not avenging ourselves, just when we had convinced ourselves that ignoring her or ignoring him will take care of the problem, we look at verse 20 and we find out that we're supposed to show up at their door with a 6-pack of Diet Pepsi and a big bag of Doritos. That's what he's really saying. We're not off the hook when we manage to make it through verse 19, because verse 19 is followed by verse 20. You haven't finished the program, he says, by refraining to execute vengeance. Because what God requires of us is that we act in this way. If God's part is to respond in justice, as it is in verse 19, then our part is to respond in a spirit of generosity. Oh, you say, let me read on. Oh, I see. Oh, well, this is a little better as you go to the second half of verse 20. Oh, this is good. If I do that, I see that the person who's been a real challenge to me, he gets a barbecue tipped on his head. Oh, I like that a lot better. That is nice now. Now things are beginning to look up. Well, clearly that would be stupidity as well, wouldn't it? It's understandable. But I hear people saying this all the time. And, well, you'll get the coals of fire on your head. And I hope they're big ones for you. You miserable, whatever you are. There you are. Keep the burning coals on your head, you know. This isn't in here as an incentive. This is in here as a consequence. If you do this, this will happen. He doesn't say do this so that it will happen. It's important that we recognize that these coals are not coals then that bring hurt, but they're coals that bring healing. That the impact is an impact that brings reconciliation, that draws the individual to us, not that drives the individual from us. Because you see, the perversity of our hearts, if we're honest, is such that we would be quite happy, many of us, to find out that these burning coals actually did land on their head and burned them and scarred them, and they could go away and do whatever they wanted for the rest of their lives, because after all, it's nothing less than they deserve. But then as soon as we go there, we know this isn't like Jesus, this doesn't look like Jesus, this doesn't sound like Jesus, this has got nothing to do with Jesus. And the Spirit of God is in the process of making me like Jesus. That's what makes it so incredibly challenging. Calvin observes, and so your enemy's mind will be torn in one of two ways, either softened by kindness or stung and tormented by his conscience. You go argue with them, they'll give you straight back. You threaten them, no problem. You love them. You treat them in the way they don't deserve. We treat them in the way that we have been treated in Christ by God the Father. I'm forced to say that in many circumstances in my own life and possibly in yours, we have yet to see the impact of that kind of persuasive love on action, because the perversity of our own hearts is such that we are like the man in the parable of the Good Samaritan, who, seeking to justify himself, said, "Who is my neighbor?" In other words, tell me the small group of people that I have to be nice to. And then Jesus tells that story that just blows the whole thing completely apart. A Samaritan. You can't have a Samaritan as the hero of the story. Oh, yes. I actually came across a wonderful illustration of this in my reading this past week. I found the story of a young lady who had gone as a missionary to the Far East. She had been a student at Cambridge in the 1940s, Cambridge University. And in 1946, 45, 46, 47 at Cambridge, she was actually the secretary of the Communist Party. Apparently, the winter of 46 into 47 in England was phenomenally severe, and the pipes were frozen to a significant level, which led in turn to a shortage of water, which meant the accommodation in which these students were living at Cambridge was such that they found themselves, these girls, only able to get a bath once a week. Now, I have lived with 3 women in my house, and I know that that is not a pleasant circumstance. Not that they were only taking a bath once a week, but if they were only able to take a bath once a week. And in that context, for the bath, there was always a long queue. There was a lot of grumbling, a lot of complaining, and a lot of moaning, and a lot of jockeying for position. One of the girls who had the most direct access to the bathroom was a Christian. The communist girl noticed over a period of time that this girl, although she did not know initially that she was a Christian, that this girl responded without asserting her rights, without pushing herself to the front. She responded quietly to the selfishness of others. And the communist girl looked at this girl and said, here is someone who is really practicing and living what I claim to believe, but what I do not do. The observation of that life led to a conversation, led to a conversion, and led to world evangelization. It wasn't that she had stood on the stairs and given a monologue on the issues of those who were vindictively pushing themselves to the front. She had simply responded in that way. Well, the chapter ends with this comprehensive punchline, verse 21, doesn't it? Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. It doesn't seem too hard to understand, does it? And it's true to say that we need to overcome the evil that is within us. If you read the commentators, there's a great debate. Is he referring here to overcoming the evil from within? The evil propensity for retaliation and so on. It's clear that we have to overcome that, but I do not think that that is what Paul has in mind. Certainly the context of enemies and the external threat and so on points us in the direction that the thought here is of overcoming threats which come to us by way of an enemy on the outside. So if we allow that enemy to establish the agenda, to engage us in such a way that we are caused to lose our temper, then we have been defeated, not by that person, but we've actually been defeated by evil, by the evil one. Because what we've endeavored to do is to squash the impact of evil done to us by the execution of a greater evil in our illicit response. So in this kind of vengeful encounter where we're on the receiving end of these things, what is so daunting about the challenge of this is that I recognize that the moment I lose control of myself, I have been overcome by evil. I have now been brought into the context in which I have no longer got the opportunity to execute the good. Whenever I find myself trying to defeat evil by my own evil thoughts, by my own evil words, by my own evil deeds, then actually I am the one who is overcome. Because evil cannot be overcome by a stronger force of the same kind. So if I curse, if I'm vengeful, then I have been sucked into that vortex, and I too have been overpowered. But if, in terms of verse 14, I bless those who persecute me, if in terms of verse 17, I do not repay evil for evil, if in terms of verse 18, I endeavor as far as it depends on me to live at peace with everyone, if in terms of verse 19, I do not take vengeance into my own hands, but I seek to leave it in the hands of God, then actually I walk the path that Jesus took. I walk the way of the cross. For it is there that love triumphed over evil. Christ did not think of himself. Christ did not reach out to defend himself. He committed his cause to him who judges justly. So, the challenge is, as I ended this morning, really, isn't it? That when we go on the wrong side of this, we have lost sight of Christ. We've lost sight of who we are as debtors to mercy. And we've failed to recognize, in the words of another Getty song, that death is dead, love has won, and Christ has conquered. because we have tried to insert ourselves in the place of God. It was His kindness that led us to repentance. And so perhaps our kindness will be the doorway into conversion for some whose faces may be in our minds, whose names may be in our hearts, and to whom we're going to have to go with the Diet Pepsi and the Doritos, because we haven't finished the deal. We have rejoiced in the fact that we have refrained from vengeance, but with God's help, we haven't done the good. That, I say, is what makes this so incredibly difficult. That's why I say this is essential Christianity. I think this is perhaps the most difficult aspect of practical Christian living that we ever encounter in the whole New Testament. I said this morning that I'd been thinking a lot about the civil rights movement in relationship to this. Of course, anybody would who was brought up in the 60s, as I was and many of you were. As soon as you come to do not overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good, you're right there, 1963 with Joan Baez. And you're singing, "We Shall Overcome." There's Pete Seeger and the whole gang. Now we're seeing the pictures from Greenwich Village. Now we're in Woodstock. Now we're at the Isle of Wight Pop Festival. Now we've got it all, and there they are, all singing, "We shall overcome one day. We'll walk hand in hand," and so it goes. And I thought about that. I was at the Isle of Wight Pop Festival. I understood why they sang those songs. Who liked that horrible racial oppression? Whoever could justify that from the Bible? Whoever could launch that into orthodoxy? They were right. That was all wrong. It was a good song, but it had no dynamic. It was an imperative without an indicative. It had no moral impetus. It had no spiritual impact. And this week I said to myself, I got to find out where that song came from. So I went to look. And I found out that "We Shall Overcome" actually began as "I Shall Overcome." "I Shall Overcome" was written by a black Methodist minister called Charles A. Tindley, who lived between 1851 and 1933. He's regarded as one of the founding fathers of African American gospel music, Charles Tindley. And I said, I got to find his song to see if there was a dynamic in his song, and of course there was. He said, "I shall overcome one day, but with His word, a sword of mine, I shall overcome." That's verse 2. Verse 3, "If Jesus will my leader be, I shall overcome one day." The peace movement took it and said, let's get the Bible out of it, let's get Jesus out of it, and we'll just overcome on our own. Well, it didn't work, because it can't work. Because the problem is in the heart of every one of us. We may be more than conquerors, but only through Him who loved us. Soon as we take away the power of God by His Spirit, through His Word, in the life of His children, then we have no impetus. We don't have the expulsive power of a new affection. But let me finish in this way. I'll quote a hymn. If in doubt, end with a hymn. In the last week or 10 days, Sue and I bumped into some people from Ireland. And we met a girl from Ireland. And she told us that she went to school in a house she went to a tiny elementary school in Ireland that was the house that had been owned by Cecil Francis Alexander. Cecil Francis Alexander wrote hymns, 500 hymns for children. The best known for us would be "All things bright and beautiful, all creatures great and small, all things wise and wonderful, the Lord God made them all." She wrote that to teach the doctrine of creation. And she wrote a ton of other hymns that nobody has ever heard or sung. And one of them goes like this. We are but little children weak, nor born in any high estate. What can we do for Jesus' sake, who is so high and good and great? Oh, day by day, each Christian child has much to do without, within, a death to die for Jesus' sake, a constant war to wage with sin. When deep within our swelling hearts the thoughts of pride and anger rise, when bitter words are on our tongues and tears of passion in our eyes, then we may stay the angry blow. Then we may check the hasty word, give gentle answers back again, and fight a battle for the Lord. And the verse that was attached to the writing of the hymn was the 21st verse of Romans chapter 12. Be not overcome of evil, but overcome evil with good. If we're going to teach it to our children, we're going to have to live it before our children. And all we are as adults is just grown-up kids. And the same pulling of the hair, the same seizing of the toys, the same punching back, the same vengefulness that we find in embryonic form in the natural propensities of children unredeemed by grace are the same ugly things that confront us every day. And we may only triumph in the power of the resurrected Christ. That is why Romans 12 is not a chapter of moralism. It is a chapter of grace, and is a chapter that defines what a church family will look like when it is embraced by grace, when it is shaped by grace, and when it just feels like grace.
Concluding our series called Shaped by Grace, you're listening to Alistair Begg, and this is Truth for Life. If you missed any of the messages in this study in Romans 12, don't forget you can listen free of charge online at truthforlife.org. Or you can request the complete series on CD, DVD, or USB at just our cost to produce without any markup. We love being able to provide these resources without cost being a prohibitive barrier. And that's made possible because listeners like you uphold this ministry through your generous giving. When you make a year-end gift today, we want to express our thanks with a compelling devotional, a book titled Love Came Down at Christmas, written by Alistair's longtime friend, Sinclair Ferguson. If someone asked you to describe the meaning of Christmas, what would you say? Well, according to many movies or TV shows or songs we hear on the radio this time of year, Christmas is all about love. And as Christians, we agree with that. But we have to clarify what we mean by love. It's more than just tender affection or sentiment. Sinclair's Advent devotional centers on 1 Corinthians 13 and helps us see how true love was expressed in the incarnation of Jesus. Request your copy of Love Came Down at Christmas when you donate today online at truthforlife.org/donate, or you can request the devotional by calling 888-588-7884. I'm Bob Lepine, hoping you'll join us Wednesday for a special message about giving thanks in every circumstance. The Bible teaching of Alistair Begg is furnished by Truth for Life, where the learning is for living.